I am going to speak to you about regenerative medicine when it can be applied to the problems of aging. And when I was listening to the other two talks, at many points it struck me that the future of health is mainly going to be about aging, and the parts that are not explicitly about aging will also closely relate to the parts that are. For example, we have heard now about the role of neural stem cells in the brain, and that, in principle, enhancements of neurogenesis could somehow combat aging. And, in fact, there are certain ways in which regenerative medicine using stem cells is already being developed to address certain aspects of aging. Similarly, the immune system, which fails so seriously in HIV, in AIDS, also declines in function in all of us as we get older, even though it does not usually decline quite so seriously. And if we want to keep people healthy for a lot longer than they naturally stay healthy, then we must do something about the decline of the immune system. And again, I believe that regenerative medicine can be applied to that problem. So I work for, have I got actually slides? Are my slides showing? Oh, yeah, good. So I work for a charity based in America which tries to develop these medicines. It's called Sense Foundation. And first of all, I want to tell you about how big a problem this is for the world today, and how important it is to develop medicine that really works against aging. Many people think that aging is what they want to die of, because they think of it as what you die of if you don't die of the diseases such as Alzheimer's or cancer or cardiovascular disease that we all want to avoid. But actually, that's not a biologically correct way of looking at the question of dying of aging. Really, all of these diseases are diseases of old age for the same reason. They are diseases that are aspects of the later stages of a process that goes on throughout life. And of course, that process is aging. When we realize that, we can see that about 2/3 of all deaths worldwide are actually due to aging, because death from aging includes all those diseases. In the USA or in Spain or anywhere in the developed world, hardly anyone dies of, for example, malaria, so the proportion of death from aging is even higher. It's maybe 90%. And even if you don't have the diseases of old age, it's still no fun getting into a decrepit, dependent, debilitated state when you get old. So this really is humanity's biggest problem, certainly humanity's biggest medical problem, even bigger than the problems that we have heard about already today. So now, first of all, I'm going to tell you what regenerative medicine is, and also what aging is. You probably have some ideas in your own mind already about this, but I want to be precise. Regenerative medicine is about restoring the structure of biological tissues, of organs, or of the whole body even. That means making it the same as it used to be before it suffered damage. And that may be done using tissue engineering to replace an entire organ with a new one that was created outside the body, or it may be using stem cell therapies to replace cells that the body does not create on its own, or it could be at the molecular level, restoring the structure of things inside the cell And it turns out that that is quite important when we talk about regenerative medicine for aging. Aging can be defined in many ways, but this is a definition that I'm going to use because it helps us to think about how we might combat aging. First of all, aging is a side effect of being alive. Metabolism is the word that biologists use to encompass all of the processes that go on in the body that keep us alive from one day to the next, from 1 year to the next. Pathology is the word I'm going to use to encompass all the things that go wrong with us in old age, all of those diseases I mentioned, and also things like decline of the immune system. So, metabolism eventually causes pathology. But how? How does it do that? The answer is, it does it by creating damage, and the damage accumulates, and that accumulating damage causes pathology when there is too much of it. What is damage? It's a set of molecular and cellular changes to the structure of the human body that are created by metabolism throughout life. And again, the key thing is that they accumulate. So that's what I'm going to mean when I use the word damage today. Here's why that definition is so useful. It helps us to distinguish between the two traditional approaches to thinking about how we might combat aging with medicine. Pretty much all medicine that we have today to combat aging can be called geriatric medicine. Geriatric medicine really involves treating the diseases of old age, the pathologies of aging, in the same way that we treat other diseases, identifying the symptoms, trying to hold back the symptoms, trying to get rid of those symptoms. But it's a losing battle because of damage. Because the damage is accumulating all the time, the job of the geriatrician is getting harder all the time as the patient gets older. So the geriatrics approach to combating aging is better than nothing, but it's not much better than nothing. And really it never can be because of this downward spiral caused by accumulating damage. That's why a lot of people have started to think over a long time now actually, starting several decades ago, that maybe we could address aging more thoroughly if we adopt the principle that prevention is better than cure. If we try to intervene earlier in the chain of events that leads from metabolism to pathology. So the gerontology approach says, let's try and clean up metabolism. Let's try and manipulate our metabolism so that it creates damage more slowly than it normally does. And of course that would work. That would delay the age at which the damage reaches a level that causes pathology. But there's a problem with the gerontology approach too, a big problem. And this is why we don't have any real medicine for aging based on this approach. Here's the problem. Metabolism is exceptionally complicated. This is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works. Okay? And as you can see, it's very nasty indeed. But actually, that's not the main problem. The main problem is not what we know about how metabolism works. The main problem, and I'm sure that every biologist agrees about this, is that the amount that we don't know about how metabolism works is enormously bigger than the amount that we do know. So the gerontology approach is an idea whose time has not come. We just don't know enough about metabolism to have any chance, really, of cleaning it up without doing more harm than good. All right, so, well, is there any other approach? I think there is. And in order to introduce it, I'm going to talk for a moment about cars. I'm going to do that because the human body is a machine. It's an incredibly complicated machine, but it's still a machine. So we might be able to learn how to extend the lifetime of the human body beyond its warranty period by looking at how we already successfully extend the longevity of simple man-made machines beyond their warranty period. This car is more than 50 years old and it's doing okay. And of course, most cars only last 10 or 15 years before they fall apart. Why is it doing okay? Simple. It was built to last. It was built with metal that doesn't rust and very tough tires and so on. And that's the same sort of reason why the human body lasts so much longer than the body of a dog or a mouse, for example. We have better built-in anti-aging machinery. But the important thing about this slide is actually not the picture, it's the title. I want to compare Land Rovers with VW Beetles, Volkswagen Beetles. Because Volkswagen Beetles are not built to last, but there are just as many 50-year-old Volkswagen Beetles driving around as there are 50-year-old Land Rovers. Here's one. It got this way because its owners have fallen in love with it, and they have done an unusually comprehensive amount of maintenance on it. That's why. Maintenance really works if it's comprehensive enough. If you really do take care of a simple man-made machine, it can last much longer than it was designed to. So what that means for the human body here is that we can avoid either of those two problems I mentioned earlier. Rather than trying to slow down the process whereby damage creates pathology, or the process where metabolism creates damage, instead we can separate those two processes from each other by periodically going into the body and repairing damage so that it does not reach that level of abundance. As you can see, this approach does not have the downward spiral problem of the geriatrics approach because damage does not have any accumulating precursors. But also, it doesn't have the problem of the complexity of metabolism, because here we are not proposing to slow down the creation of damage, so we are effectively able to sidestep our enormous ignorance about metabolism. So I think this approach is much more promising than the other two. Another reason why it's much more promising is that if we think, well, okay, let's get down to real biology. What is damage in concrete biological terms at the molecular and cellular level? If we ask that question, it seems that there are not very many types of damage. It's much simpler than metabolism or pathology. I think that all of the things that qualify as damage, the intermediates between metabolism and pathology, can be classified into one or another of these 7 categories. So, for example, molecular byproducts of normal metabolic processes that, for whatever reason, the cell does not have the machinery to break down or to excrete, the cell simply sequesters that stuff and it accumulates. That's what I'm calling junk inside cells. Of course, it can happen in the spaces between cells as well, such as the amyloid that we see in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. We can have too few cells when cells die and they are not automatically replaced by the division and differentiation of other cells. An example of that in aging is Parkinson's disease. And as we heard in the previous talk, there are areas of the brain which do not have neurogenesis. There's one particular area which suffers a lot of cell death, in Parkinson's disease especially, and the problem is that those cells are not replaced. And if I had more time, I would go on down this list. The point is, we can actually be quite confident at this point that this really is all the types of damage. First of all of these types of damage have been discovered and discussed and researched for nearly 30 years, in many cases a lot longer. we really ought to have extended this list if there were other categories. Also, we can just look at what the body is made of and look at the long-lived structures in which damage could accumulate. And we get this list just by that approach as well. So that's good news. But the really good news is that it seems at this moment that we are quite close, maybe only a few decades away, from developing therapies that really do repair each of these types of damage. We have heard already about stem cells. Stem cell therapies for Parkinson's disease are already in early stage clinical trials. They're not working very well yet, but we're getting there. Removal of the amyloid in the brain in Alzheimer's disease is something that is also in clinical trials, late-stage clinical trials in that case, and it's being done by immunization, by vaccinating against the material that we want to get rid of. Many of the other types of damage are much harder to repair than that, but in each case we can describe in a lot of detail, in really good detail, how we would go about it. So we, I think, can be confident that we have a good chance of developing these technologies within, let's say, the next 25 years. And, of course, that is a speculative estimate. It might be 100 years. But if we've got a fairly good chance of doing it in only 25 years, then for sure we ought to be trying, because of the magnitude of the problem, the amount of suffering and death that aging causes. I'm just going to show very briefly some data looking at this one type of damage, junk inside cells. The idea that we have is to use bacteria, which we find in the environment, and that are able to break down the molecules that we cannot break down. We don't propose, in this case, unlike what Dean was proposing earlier, we don't propose to put the bacteria themselves into the body. In this case, we identify the genes that they are using, and we put those genes into the body so that our cells are more powerful than they normally would be at breaking things down. This seems to be possible. In this slide, I'm showing the fact that we can find bacteria that break down very important toxic molecules. This is a molecule that helps to cause cardiovascular disease. We can also identify the genes. In my foundation's work, we have started to put those genes into human cells in culture, in the laboratory, and we have shown that they work. They protect cells against these toxic things. So I'm out of time, so I will just tell you that if you want to know more about this, there is a book that I wrote a few years ago. I mentioned that each of these various types of damage and the ways to fix them are understood in a lot of detail, and that's where you can find that information. There is an entire chapter of this book about each of those types of damage and the ways to repair them. Of course, there are also various academic papers in the academic literature which I and other colleagues have published on these things, but for a general audience, this is the place to start. Sense Foundation is, of course, a charity, but we do not only need money to do this work. We certainly do need money. I think it's important to say that. But, like any scientist, needs money. But also, we need all of you to do what you can in your lives to hasten the development of these therapies. Of course, conference organizers can invite me to give a lecture, and journalists can interview me, and biologists can work in the most relevant areas of biology. But all of you can do something else. All of you can do advocacy. If you understand the importance of what I have told you in the last 20 minutes, and you think that it would be a good thing to develop therapies that stop people forever from getting Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease or cancer in old age, or type 2 diabetes, or osteoarthritis, or any of the other things that your parents probably have, then tell people about it. Ultimately, this will only happen quickly if there is public enthusiasm that translates into public policy. The defeat of aging, the biology of aging, is an extraordinarily underfunded area of science, given how massive its potential is. Hardly any money goes into developing medicines like this that we can call preventative geriatrics, even though enormous amounts of money go into developing geriatric treatments, which are ultimately futile for the reasons I have already told you. So, I'd like you to go away and think about that and do something. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues. Let's make it happen. Thank you.